A lot to discuss. Let's meet our panel here in the studio. Sourabh Gupta is a senior Asia-Pacific policy analyst at the Institute for China-America Studies. From Beijing, Victor Gao is an international affairs commentator. From Los Angeles, the global business executive Ryan Patel. And also with us in the studio is CGTN correspondent Nathan King. Welcome to you all. Let's start in Beijing with Victor. And Victor, this was a key address in which President Xi reiterated much of what he's been saying for a very long time, that China is a champion of globalization and free trade. We heard this from the president at the World Economic Forum in Davos. We heard it at the 19th Party Congress. We heard it at the Two Sessions meeting. So would you agree that, in a sense, this was a reaffirmation from the president of long-standing Chinese goals and policies?
Yes, indeed. In his very important speech yesterday at the Boao Asian Forum, President Xi Jinping really rededicated China to opening and reform, and recommitted China to globalization and international trade with all the rest of the world. And he has announced a flurry of new initiatives aimed at tearing down more barriers in trade and also providing more access to the Chinese market. For example, he also emphasized that the restrictions on the percentage owning by foreign companies in China, including in the automobile sector, will be eliminated or reduced. And I think this is exactly the messages that the rest of the world and here we in China are expecting, because this is a time for China to make a firm decision as to which direction it wants to go. And whichever direction China chooses will have a major impact on the rest of the world. And I think President Xi Jinping made the right announcement, give the reassurance to the investors globally, and recommitted China in the right direction of more reform and opening to the outside world.
Okay, let's welcome Ryan Patel to the show. And Ryan, given the Chinese position on free trade, the removal of protectionist barriers, the promotion of globalization, as I've said, President Xi has been saying this for some time. He said, look, we don't just want to open the door, we want to open it even wider. Has this been lost on the United States, which has introduced tariffs, was proposing tariffs on Chinese imports, which is putting up protectionist barriers, which is talking about America first? Has it been lost here?
Yeah, I mean, he mentioned today, the president of China mentioned today that we can't treat this as Cold War mentality. And, yes, China has said this in the past, this theme of opening borders and being able to be the global player, I think. But what makes it different now, they laid out the whole framework. You talk about the automobile industry, they're talking about tariffs this year lowering. He's put an actual time frame to it. And so I think you're putting U.S. at odds on kind of going the opposite direction. And more importantly, other countries are watching this, and they're seeing what China is trying to do here. And obviously, they're opening foreign investment. This is not just for the U.S. This is a message for the rest of the global economy to say, China is here to open the door. And, if you want to go the opposite direction, i.e., if the U.S. is becoming more protectionism, China is willing to do more business with other people. So to me, this message is obviously not just for the U.S., but for China as an economy and for them to cement themselves as trying to be the player out there.
And Sourabh, the message could not have been clearer. Let's listen to part of what President Xi had to say. Let's watch. Do we have that? No, we don't. In essence, what the president was saying was that there's going to be no deviation from the path that he has chosen, that they're very serious about these policies and that these policies will be implemented. He is going to be sticking to policy. And how significant is it that there's been no knee-jerk reaction to what President Trump has been doing? This is well thought out. We will not, be thrown off course. We're going to stick on the road.
Absolutely. I thought this reaffirmation was very important because, yes, he has talked on many of these reforms ever since he was the chair of the G20 at the Hangzhou summit. But the important point is this was the first time he had to reaffirm this after the initiation of the so-called trade war by the Trump administration, its actions in terms of the steel and aluminum tariffs and on IPR. It was easy for President Xi, having said this, talked about openness and globalization and its importance on so many occasions, to direct and focus his speech more as a rejoinder to Trump and try to say of the things that he was going to do against the United States, et cetera, and that how quickly that could spiral downwards, we know. The important thing is, at this moment, he felt it was important to redouble and reaffirm China's commitment to open markets, while at the same time, he touched on many of those points which Trump has dwelt on, and he suggested, look, on all these various points, I am open and amenable, and I wish to reform further. So he also, in a way, extended his hand to Trump and to the US administration that if they want to de-escalate the situation, this speech could be a basis on which they could proceed.
So Nathan, we got the big picture there, but let's drill down into some specifics. Reduction in automobile tariffs, and another big issue, intellectual property rights. How significant was the announcement on those issues?
Well, it's exactly what the Americans wanted to hear. You know, it may have been a timely reminder, but the focus, the sound bites that have been picked up here in the US media are basically saying, oh, this is exactly what we want to hear. As we know, the US President Trump and his advisors have an obsession with the trade deficit. They also have an obsession with access for autos. You saw it with the South Korean reworking of the Chorus deal. You're seeing it over NAFTA. They really want to push US cars. So because there is a 25% tariff going into the US, they want that brought down. The big problem for the car industry in the US is they're making stuff that the Chinese don't want to buy, essentially, at the moment. F-150s, those big trucks, they wouldn't work on the crowded streets of Shanghai and Beijing. And because also China is moving to much more renewable and green energy cars, and the US is moving, if anything, away from that, there's not an exact fit. But if that opens up, that will satisfy one of Donald Trump's key concerns. And the big question here is, are we going to get some sort of quick deal before these tariffs that are slated on the 50 billion lists that both countries have now issued, and we're still waiting for 100 billion lists? Could we get a quick deal on, say, autos and market access for others? Or are the people around the president going to push for something more? And what they're calling for is a fundamental realignment of the US-China relationship when it comes to trade, but also the industries of tomorrow. I think, potentially, if you're in Beijing, you want to go for the quick win and satisfy Donald Trump.
What's the realignment that the Americans are looking for?
Well, if you listen to Robert Lighthizer, the US trade representative, or Peter Navarro, who's head of the Trade and Manufacturing Council, basically what they are worried about is China 25, the big plan to basically become a leader and a global leader in the industries of the future. We're talking robotics, we're talking pharmaceuticals, we're talking semiconductors, we're talking all of the components of a 21st century economy. The US thinks that potentially they could fall behind because of the Chinese model is actually a little bit more efficient when it comes to research and development and state sponsorship. But they also, Peter Navarro especially, wants to bring the global supply chain away from China and other countries as well and bring it back here in the US. They think that basically they can almost turn back time in terms of US manufacturing base. Most economists, in fact, the overwhelming number of economists disagree.
All right, Victor, looking at President Xi's speech, there was also a very broad foreign policy philosophy, if I could put it that way, that he articulated. He said that reform will definitely succeed and that a Cold War mentality, you mentioned that a moment ago, zero-sum thinking and isolationism would hit walls. That was directed at the United States pretty squarely, wasn't it?
Yes, I think so. And I think the rest of the world, listening to President Xi Jinping's important speech, will come to the same conclusion. The world is at a crossroad, and there are two options, and the rest of the world need to pick and choose. One is what President Xi Jinping and China has pointed out, that is more reform, more embracing the rest of the world, globalization, free trade, treating each other as equals, and looking forward to face the brave new world. Now, the other one is very much what President Donald Trump has been preaching, which is very misleading to the US as well as the rest of the world. That is more protectionism, more trade barriers, putting America first, putting the rest of the world the last and least, for example, and it's a very unequal treatment of other countries. Keep lecturing the rest of the world. Keep imposing your own value onto the other countries and people, and anti-globalization, and walking away from principles and commitments at the United Nations or WTO, walking away from your commitments to other international organizations, for example. And I think the rest of the world is very wise. They can listen to both what President Xi Jinping has been talking about and to what President Donald Trump has been talking about, and come to their own mind. And I think the choice is a very important choice. And I hope President Donald Trump and the rest of his team will come to the conclusion that going back is not possible. Going back will really hurt and damage the fundamental interests of the American people. The American people can be better served if they really look forward rather than backward. Embrace the rest of the world. Embrace more globalization. Right. Try to come up with more innovation. And that will be a winning recipe for the United States.
Ryan, you know, Victor Gao mentioned values there, and there could not be two other leaders in the world who have very different views on world trade. On the one hand, you've got President Xi, who's been a champion of globalization. On the other hand, you have Donald Trump, who's been talking about America first. The Trump administration talking about wide-ranging tariffs amounting to billions of dollars. I'm wondering, to what extent was this speech by President Xi, in one sense, a warning that things could go wrong here? In fact, President Xi has said before, if this leads to a trade war, nobody's going to win.
Yeah, I mean, he did a fantastic, I mean, you have to listen to the speech. He did a fantastic job of laying out the groundwork. I mean, it is very public now, and that, you know, the ball is really in the U.S. court to be able to either follow it or not. Obviously, you've been seeing the investment community, the corporate community, in the middle of this last few weeks with the market going up and down. They've been more vocal about how a trade war is not good, and many businesses are actually is a proponent for globalization here in the U.S. because they want to grow their top line revenue, and they're for this free trade. So the administration obviously has its views, but also its constituents are these companies that are there. So they, you know, when the investment community rises up and Wall Street rises up and says, hey, this is a bad thing, these values, these really, more importantly, the structure needs to come into place. And so I feel like they're at ends right now, and I think China did a fantastic job today on laying out to everyone, not just the U.S., here are the things we stand for. The ball is now in the U.S.'s court to react to it accordingly.
Can I just say something? With all respect to President Xi, this is a big own goal for the Trump administration as well. I mean, who would have thought 10 years ago that the United States, the party of Ronald Reagan, the Republicans, would be considered anti-free trade and anti-globalization? This is an own goal that they've kicked on themselves. And, you know, everyone around the world knows that China is reforming. Right. What's been the question is the pace of reform. And the Europeans and the Americans, the Japanese and others, actually had common ground about wanting to push China to go faster. Now, it's up to China what it does. But they could have actually come together here. Yeah. But this White House decided to slap steel and aluminum tariffs, or at least threaten it, and created a feeling around the world that they didn't want to work with the US in concert. This is a gift to Xi Jinping. And, you know, it's a pretty softball.
And so, Rob, you know, Nathan mentions the pace of reform, and this was addressed by President Xi in the speech. He talked about continuing Chinese reforms. He talked about the road ahead. You know, that was clearly enunciated by the president of China. But he also talked about implementing these plans that he has. He's not just talking the talk, he's walking the walk here, you know, talking about implementation. Let's watch what he said.
What I want to emphasize is that all the major policies and reforms that I just announced would be implemented as soon as possible. The earlier the better, the faster the better. We must work hard to ensure that China's opening up could benefit not only Chinese people and companies, but people and companies all across the world.
So fair to say, then, that this is not just rhetoric. These are dynamic plans that China wants to implement soon.
Oh, absolutely. These are dynamic plans. I think what he got perfect was actually this balance between the broad philosophical angle that we need to keep markets open and globalization needs to be aided and supported. And at the same time, he He was specific enough in particular areas where he is ready and willing and about to deepen reform. A lot of this has been kind of baked in over the last 6 months, and this became part of the government work program. So he is in a position, after the political season has ended in Beijing, to really drive forward and implement the reforms. So I think from that perspective, it was very, very useful, the way he laid out both the broad angle and the specifics out here. And frankly, I think there's enough on the table right now for the Americans to proceed with, to have a dialogue and consultations with China to find a common ground where some of the harsh measures can really, really be set aside. Can I make one other point? This is one area where I wish President Xi would have touched on a little bit more, and this is with regard to the WTO's dispute settlement body. It is really what I would say the crown jewel of global governance in the post-Cold War world. Big powers submitting themselves to a neutral umpire, and this thing. This has worked very, very well for the past 20 years, and I wish China will bring this little more further into its communication, that China stands ready to adhere to WTO verdicts, but bring it there. That is the forum to discuss it. And China will faithfully abide by the rulings which WTO makes, and it hopes that other big countries, big and small countries, would also respect the WTO's dispute settlement body in the same way.
Nathan, we hear a lot of controversial comments coming from Donald Trump, specifically in this relationship with China. And I'm wondering, to what extent is he playing politics here in the United States, talking to his base? And at what point does he come to some kind of realization that this is serious stuff? I mean, he does portray the United States as being the victim in this. Just listen to this.
Yeah.
Where we have a very good relationship with China, and I think we'll maintain that relationship. I'm very good friends with President Xi. I have great respect for President Xi. With that being said, China has been taking advantage of the United States for many years. Really, if you look at it, since the start of the World Trade Organization, and they have really done a number on this country. And I don't blame China. I blame the people running our country.
Done a number on this country. It's a bit of a distortion on the relationship.
Whenever Trump starts saying, I really love President Xi, I think, what's coming next? Because he always starts negative comments about China like that. To pick up on the political point, you're absolutely right. Look, he campaigned on slapping tariffs on China. Rallies I'd go to, it'd be 35% one day, 45% the next. He said he was going to do it. And his base partly elected him for reasons that we can go into, on the fact that they feel, especially in the depressed economic areas and in rural areas, that somehow China was to blame. Peter Navarro, for example, the manufacturing advisor, said, look, 60,000 factories have gone since China joined the WTO. I mean, he doesn't talk about the fact that those factories closed down because of competitiveness, the US moving up the value chain, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's all China's fault. But you know, he has a constituency there, which is about 25 to 30% of the population. The problem is for Trump, is that when he put out this $50 billion list, they tried to avoid any harm to consumers, Walmart buyers and stuff, didn't want price inflation, people paying more out of their wallets. But when China responded with the list, of course, soybeans were on it. This is the rural heartland that could get hit. And farmers are fed up with it. They get hit. They've had problems in the domestic market. Exports are really the only way forward. And farmers are saying, why should we get hit with a Donald Trump tariff policy that he said he was going to look after us? And if you're worried about the industries of the future, why are you doing agriculture and sacrificing them for Silicon Valley? So there's all these politics that could play out. We've got the midterm elections in November, and a lot of red states could turn blue, Democratic.
Victor, to Sourabh's point on a role for the WTO, this was to a certain extent addressed by President Xi. He said China fully embraces and supports the existing international system. China, the president said, will not threaten anyone else, seek to overturn the existing international system, or seek spheres of influence. There's quite a lot in there, isn't there?
Yes, indeed. I think in this round of the trade war between China and the United States, it's very clear that China actually sticks with the WTO. China wants to conduct its business relations with the rest of the world by abiding by the principles of WTO, whereas President Donald Trump wants to put the United States above the WTO, and he cares nothing about violating the commitments to the WTO or the principles of the WTO, and using the domestic legislation like the Article 301 to impose sanctions or tariffs on China, for example, is exactly the opposite of abiding by the WTO rules. Again, I think we see two very opposite behavior and attitude. One is to respect the WTO, one is to disregard the WTO, and I think which is right, which is wrong is very obvious. And I think in his speech, President Xi Jinping also made it very clear that China wants to be a part of the international community, and China wants to abide by the rules. China has no ambition or desire to overthrow the current international order. And it is the United States which is really creating chaos and all the uncertainty about the current international order.
Ryan, the speech was pretty clear. I mean, the essence of the speech was China is open for business. How do you think the message is being heard in the United States?
Well, I think it depends who you ask. If you saw, President Trump's Twitter, I mean, he's taking it. It looks like he's twisting this to a certain degree as a win. That hey, they're coming to negotiate, and going into the midterm elections, you feel like that's going to be the rhetoric going into. Look what we did. I think from the other side of it, from a business perspective, I don't think we're done yet. I think. I'm really interested to see how the administration is going to react. Are they going to come off of some of these policies? As Nathan pointed out, soybeans tariff was round number 2. It wasn't round number 1. They were trying to get to see if the U.S. would come back with further tariffs. So with this kind of you can argue if this was an olive branch or not. I believe it was to say, okay, let's stop this. Let's stop messing with the markets. Let's stop messing with everything that's going on with people's emotions. Let's come to the table and find 1 to 2 things. I think right now, the Americans are looking at to see, can the administration in China come to get at least 1 win? I don't think this is going to get solved overnight, obviously. Yeah. I don't think all of this will. But obviously, when you talk about IP and automotive tariffs, which one are they going to pick? And I think that's going to be really important.
Okay, Nathan, time's catching up with us, but I want to get to this. And that is one other big important speaker at the forum was Christine Lagarde, Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. Here's what she had to say.
I congratulate you, President Xi, for this new life that you have identified, for the openness that you have celebrated and advocated, for the innovation and inclusiveness that you have encouraged. And you have not only been saying that in general terms, you've been very specific. Opening sectors, banking, insurance, automotive, removing caps, reducing barriers, providing a more business-friendly environment. You've advocated openness.
That's a pretty significant endorsement from the leader of one of the world's biggest international institutions.
Yeah, we're going to have the IMF World Bank hearings, meetings here next week, so it's going to be interesting if she continues that theme. You're always nice to your host, but that was pretty nice. And I think also what she was saying was laying out what Xi Jinping had said, so it was reiterated, but also saying, hey, this is what you've said. Yeah. And it might be a way of saying, look, these reforms have been promised, let's see if they're delivered in a very polite way indeed. I thought it was an interesting endorsement, and of course, it's another global figure saying, okay, we're behind you in this new period of Chinese development. Let's see what happens.
Sourabh, has President Xi here, in a sense, also laid the groundwork for substantive negotiation with countries like the United States, perhaps with the rest of the world, to reach what China has said many times, win-win outcomes?
I think in this speech, the focus was more on the economic elements in terms of globalization, not so much on the political elements. He touched upon the political elements in a very wide-ranging speech when he spoke in Geneva last year, when he went to Switzerland and then thereafter Davos. But I think there's amply enough on the table for parties to get together and talk, consult, discuss, and find ways out of the predicament that they have put themselves in, particularly with the tariffs that Trump has threatened to impose.
And that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.